Hey everybody, it's Mr. Sodders. Welcome back to another AP Government Online lecture. Today we're going to focus on topic 1.7, the relationship between federal and state governments. We have the following enduring understanding that federalism reflects the dynamic distribution of power between national and state government. Now we're going to explain how societal needs affect the constitutional allocation of power between the national and state governments. And we're going to focus on the following two pieces of knowledge. The exclusive and concurrent powers of the national and state governments help explain the negotiations over the balance of power between the two levels. The distribution of power between the federal and state governments to meet the needs of society changes as reflected by grants, incentives, and aid programs, including federal revenue sharing, mandates, categorical grants, and block grants. First, what is federalism? According to your textbook, federalism is the distribution of constitutional authority between state governments and the national government with different powers and functions. The fact that specifically the Founding Fathers created a system in which they wanted to give power to the federal government, but they also wanted to give power to the state governments. We also need to include local governments as a part of federalism because there are responsibilities that local governments have that state and or federal governments do not have in our lives. So why do we want federalism? There's multiple checks on governmental power. We can protect liberties by allowing the competition between federal governments and state governments and even local governments to hold each level of government to account. It's another check on power. When there's division of powers in multiple entities, it is able to limit government better for us. We want to provide balance between national and state governments. We want to make sure the federal government never gets too powerful. The same thing, we never want the state governments to become too powerful. And we want to avoid tyranny. We want to limit government. States can make decisions for their unique situations. Each state is different geographically, culturally, and so sometimes a state needs to be able to make policies for itself because it is most relevant to its unique situation. We allows for local action and local concerns to be addressed. We want local governments to focus on what is happening within their own town or city. And the more access points we have, the more ways that we as individuals can participate in the political process in terms of voting, in terms of reaching out to political officials, in terms of protests, whatever that might be, we allow ourselves to have better access to government. In the Constitution, there are 4 areas that we want to focus as to where we see federalism in the Constitution. Number 1, the enumerated powers. These are the powers clearly identified to the federal government, specifically given to Congress. And those are found in Article 1, Section 8. You need to know Article 1, Section 8. You don't need to memorize every power. However, you want to have a good idea of what all those powers are found in Article 1, Section 8. The implied powers originate through the necessary and proper clause, that there are enumerated powers, but there are also times in which Congress needs to be able to do something that is not explicitly in the Constitution. And so we give Congress the flexibility to take action. The Supremacy Clause in Article 6, Clause 2, says that when it comes to a debate or a difference between state governments and federal governments, that generally federal governments will be considered supreme and more powerful than the state governments. And lastly, the reserved powers, meaning any power that's not clearly listed in the Constitution, should be reserved for the states. And that is the 10th Amendment, which originates reserved powers. When we think about exclusive versus concurrent powers, we're talking about what are the powers regarding exclusive powers that are given exclusively to the federal government or exclusively to the state governments. That's where we see a separation between the two levels of government. However, there are certain things in which both state governments have that power and federal government or national government has that power. Those would be considered concurrent powers. I'm not explicitly going to talk about each of these powers. However, this is a great place to pause this lecture and to take note of the different exclusive or concurrent powers. When we think of theories of federalism and what federalism should be, there are two ways of approaching federalism. First, cooperative federalism, which in the marble cake metaphor, we call it marble cake federalism. And this is the idea that we have both state and national governments sharing powers and policy responsibilities. Just like with the marble cake, the flavors are mixed with one another, and they work together to give us a unique flavor. On the opposite side, we have dual federalism or layer cake federalism. This is when state and national governments remain separate in their own spheres, that there are not a lot of overlaps between the two levels, that each level of government has very distinct expectations. And so with these theories of federalism, we're talking about what we think federalism should be. Some people think that both levels should be working together and cooperating regularly. Others say no, there needs to be a more distinct and defined line between when federal governments should be responsible for things and state governments. Below, you will see devolution or devolution, also known as new federalism. This really falls under the conservative viewpoints of Richard Nixon and definitely under Ronald Reagan, where there is a big push to reverse what had happened in the early parts of the 20th century, where the federal government was giving more and more power over the states. Reagan had a big push to take that federal power and to delegate those powers back to the states. And we'll talk about that through how they did so through block grants. When we think of the tools of federalism, how can the federal government maintain power over the state governments? How can a president and a conservative Congress in the 1980s ultimately delegate powers back to the states? The first would be categorical grants, and categorical grants generally give more power to the federal government. Categorical grants are grants that appropriate federal funds to states for a specific purpose. For example, the Special Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program for Women, Infants, and Children with WIC. That is giving money and assistance to those people that need that assistance, and they do so through the federal government. An example would be block grants in the 1990s during devolution or devolution. Block grants were used to take that issues of welfare and give it back to the states. So block grants are large grants given to a state by the federal government with only general spending guidelines, because block grants have the intention of giving states the ability to be more specific of how that money will be spent. An example would be the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Act, or the TANF, and that is allowing states to determine how they're going to give money or assistance to those people who need it most. Lastly, we have mandates, a requirement that states or local governments meet a specific condition in order to receive federal aid. Sometimes mandates, there's money attached to it, federal aid attached to it. Other times there's not, where federal government just tells states, you need to do this. One example of one of those mandates would be the Americans with Disabilities Act, which requires states to ensure the needs of those with disabilities are met. The other is the National Minimum Drinking Age Act, which ties interstate highway money, where the federal government will give states federal highway money if and only if they raise their drinking age to 21. So with these tools and thinking about where we want federalism to be, and through the powers outlined in the Constitution, we're going to explore